For 36 years, two mysteries haunted different states. A young mother murdered in the Arizona desert, nameless and forgotten. Two babies found abandoned in a California restroom, crying on cold concrete. No one knew they were connected, that the woman died protecting her children's future, or that those infants would grow up never knowing their mother's name. Time buried the truth beneath decades of silence. But DNA remembers what memory forgets, and sometimes the dead speak through the living they saved. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Bakersfield, California, in August 1989. Cicadas droned in the dusty heat as Esther rocked 2-month-old Jasmin on the front porch, while 4-month-old Elizabeth played at her feet. The babies had been staying with Esther for weeks, while their mother Marina served time for shoplifting, another consequence of the poverty and instability that shadowed Marina's young life. When the familiar sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street, Esther looked up to see Marina approaching with a man she didn't recognize. Marina moved with nervous energy, her eyes darting between the babies and the quiet stranger who hung back near the car. She had called him Fernando earlier, though Esther thought she heard the name Monico as well. The man was Hispanic, medium build, watchful in a way that made Esther uncomfortable. "I'm here for the girls," Marina announced, scooping Elizabeth into her arms before Esther could respond. The baby giggled and reached for her mother's face, unaware of the tension crackling between the adults. Marina's voice carried a forced brightness that didn't match her anxious movements. "We're going to Ontario. Going to start fresh. You know, Fernando's got work lined up there." Esther stood slowly, still holding Jasmin, studying the man who remained silent beside the car. Something about his stillness felt wrong. Predatory almost. "Marina, you sure about this? You just got out yesterday. Maybe you should think." "I've been thinking for months," Marina interrupted, reaching for Jasmin. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her daughters. "This is our chance. The girls deserve better than this." She gestured vaguely at the rundown neighborhood, the cracked sidewalks, the general air of resignation that permeated their lives. Esther wanted to argue, to insist Marina stay longer, think harder, choose more carefully. But Marina was already moving toward the car, the babies in her arms, Fernando opening the passenger door with mechanical precision. As Marina settled into the seat with her daughters, she looked back at Esther with something that might have been regret, or might have been goodbye. "Take care of yourself, Prima," Marina called softly as Fernando started the engine. The car pulled away from the curb, taillights disappearing into the maze of Bakersfield's evening traffic. Esther stood on the porch long after the sound faded, a cold knot of worry settling in her stomach, despite the oppressive heat. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, Marina and the babies were already gone, swallowed by the endless network of California highways. No one would see them alive together again. The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, as Marina, Fernando, and the children traveled south through the night. The car moved in heavy silence, Fernando's hands gripping the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that made conversation impossible. Marina held her daughters close, feeling the weight of her decisions settling around her like a shroud. Elizabeth slept fitfully against Marina's shoulder, while baby Jasmin fussed intermittently, picking up on the tension that filled the car like smoke. Marina whispered softly to calm them, her voice the only sound breaking the mechanical hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt. This unrecorded journey became the first disappearance, a family vanishing into the anonymous flow of holiday traffic with no breadcrumbs to mark their path. No credit card receipts, no motel registrations, no gas station security cameras that might have captured their faces. In 1989, it was remarkably easy for people to simply vanish if they chose to travel without leaving traces. Marina's jail records would later show no stable address, making her nearly invisible in the databases that might have tracked her movements. To the systems designed to monitor and protect, she was already a ghost, a woman using an alias, moving between temporary addresses, existing in the margins where documentation was sparse and oversight was minimal. The highways grew darker and emptier as they drove through the night. Other travelers, families heading to Disneyland, truckers making deadlines, young couples escaping to Vegas, passed them without a second glance. How could they know? They were witnessing a tragedy in motion, a mother and her babies speeding toward a destiny none of them would survive intact. Sometime past midnight, the roads turned quieter, more desolate. The cheerful lights of gas stations and fast food restaurants became scarce, replaced by vast stretches of desert darkness, punctuated only by the occasional semi-truck or late-night commuter. Marina dozed fitfully, one arm around each daughter, while Fernando drove on in silence toward whatever destination he had chosen for them all. The car disappeared into the black stretch of highway like a stone dropped into deep water, leaving no ripples to mark its passage. In the morning, concerned citizens would go about their daily routines, with no knowledge that a young mother and her babies had just crossed the line between hopeful journey and inexorable doom. On the morning of December 12, 1989, 4 tourists from Phoenix were driving toward the Grand Canyon, their car loaded with cameras and guidebooks, when they spotted what appeared to be a dead animal lying in the middle of Old Temple Bar Road in Mohave County, Arizona. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape so vast and empty it seemed to swallow sound itself. The wind cut across the barren terrain with a sharpness that made the tourists roll up their windows despite the morning sun. Something about the shape on the asphalt nagged at the driver. It looked wrong somehow, too large for the usual roadkill that littered desert highways. After a brief discussion, they decided to circle back for a closer look. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Instead of an animal, they discovered the nude body of a young Hispanic woman, her dark hair splayed across the rough asphalt. Multiple stab wounds were visible even from a distance, and the positioning of her body suggested she had died where she lay, rather than being transported there after death. The tourists called 911 with shaking hands. Their planned vacation instantly transformed into the worst day of their lives. They waited by their car, unable to look directly at the scene but unwilling to leave, until the sound of approaching sirens finally broke the desert's terrible silence. Mohave County deputies arrived to find a crime scene that was both brutal and frustratingly empty. The body lay exposed under the desert sun, surrounded by tire tracks pressed into the sandy soil and footprints of varying sizes that suggested multiple individuals had been present. Scattered around the scene were small bits of torn clothing, fragments of a life violently interrupted. But there was no identification, no jewelry, no purse or personal belongings that might have revealed who this young woman was or why she had ended up murdered on a desolate stretch of desert road. Her fingerprints were carefully taken, though the primitive databases of 1989 would yield no matches. She became Jane Doe, filed away in an expanding collection of nameless victims. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the morning heat, photographing everything from multiple angles, casting impressions of the tire tracks and footprints, collecting every scrap of fabric and potential evidence. They treated the scene with the reverence due to any human being, even one whose name remained unknown. By noon, the body was transported to the Kingman morgue, beginning what would become a 3-decade journey through filing cabinets, evidence rooms, and the persistent efforts of investigators who refused to let Jane Doe disappear completely into bureaucratic oblivion. The wind blew sand over the tire tracks as deputies finished photographing the scene, already beginning to erase the physical traces of whatever violence had occurred there. 2 days later, on December 14, 1989, a man taking his usual morning walk through a quiet neighborhood park in Oxnard, California, heard an unusual sound that made him pause on the tree-lined path, crying not the distant sound of children playing, but the desperate, sustained wailing of infants in distress. Following the sound, he traced it to the women's restroom near the park's playground. The building was small and unremarkable, painted a cheerful yellow that seemed to mock the gravity of what lay inside. Too uncomfortable to enter himself, he flagged down a woman jogging past and asked her to check inside. What she found on the wet concrete floor of that restroom would change 4 lives forever. 2 little girls, one approximately 14 months old, the other barely 2 months, lay crying on the cold, damp surface. Their clothes were soaked through, suggesting they had been there for hours. No diaper bags, no bottles, no identifying items of any kind accompanied them. The older baby was mobile enough to have crawled around the small space, leaving tiny handprints on the walls as she tried to understand her. Abandonment. The infant could only cry, her voice already hoarse from hours of distress. Both children showed signs of dehydration and exposure, though they appeared otherwise unharmed. Police and Child Protective Services arrived to find the restroom surrounded by curious neighbors and park-goers, all trying to understand how 2 babies could have ended up alone in such a place. Witnesses reported seeing a Hispanic woman and 2 Hispanic men near the restroom earlier that morning, along with a black mini pickup truck that had left the parking area around the time the crying was first noticed. The description was frustratingly vague, the kind of details that seemed significant in the moment, but proved nearly impossible to verify or track down. The truck was small and dark. The men were of average height and build, The woman appeared young. In a community with a substantial Hispanic population, such descriptions could apply to hundreds of people. Emergency medical technicians checked both children carefully, finding them malnourished but responsive. The older child reached for the paramedics with the trusting desperation of someone too young to understand betrayal. The infant's cries gradually subsided as she was wrapped in warm blankets and given formula, her tiny body finally beginning to relax after hours of terror and confusion. By evening, both children were placed in emergency foster care, while authorities began the seemingly impossible task of identifying them. No missing children reports matched their ages or descriptions. No hospitals had records of recent births that might explain their presence. They existed in a bureaucratic vacuum, as nameless and mysterious as the woman found dead in the Arizona desert 2 days earlier. A local news station ran a brief segment titled, "Mystery Babies Found in Park Restroom," showing footage of the yellow building and interviewing the jogger who had discovered them. The story generated sympathy but no useful leads. Whoever had abandoned these children had done so without leaving any trace of their own identities. In the weeks that followed, Ventura County Child Protective Services worked tirelessly to identify the abandoned infants. Caseworkers documented every detail of their physical condition, took photographs from multiple angles, and reached out to hospitals throughout Southern California, hoping to match birth records with the children's estimated ages. The older child showed signs of normal development for a 4-month-old. She could stand while holding onto furniture, babbled in what sounded like Spanish and English, and responded to affection with the resilience that sometimes allows young children to adapt to traumatic circumstances. The younger infant exhibited the normal reflexes and responses of a 2-month-old, suggesting she had received adequate care until the moment of abandonment. Despite extensive outreach efforts, no relatives came forward to claim them. No one reported them missing. The children existed in a statistical anomaly present in the system, but absent from the networks of family, community, and documentation that usually surround young lives. Regional hospitals were contacted, birth certificates cross-referenced, welfare rolls examined for any mention of children matching their descriptions. Immigration services were notified in case the family had crossed borders recently. Missing children databases, though primitive by modern standards, were searched exhaustively. Community members rallied around the children with donations of clothing, toys, formula, and offers to provide temporary homes. The story touched something deep in the public consciousness. 2 innocent children abandoned by circumstances beyond their comprehension, now dependent on the kindness of strangers for their very survival. Weeks turned into months as the bureaucratic machinery slowly processed their cases. Temporary names were assigned for administrative purposes, though everyone understood these were placeholders until their real identities could be established. Medical examinations confirmed they were sisters, sharing enough physical characteristics to suggest common parentage. The younger infant's features were consistent with a child delivered just months earlier, matching the timeline that Marina's family would later describe to investigators. But in 1989, without modern DNA testing capabilities, and with no missing person reports to guide their search, this connection remained invisible to those trying to help. As winter gave way to spring, paperwork for long-term foster placement began moving through the system. The immediate crisis of their abandonment evolved into the long-term challenge of providing stable homes for children whose histories remained completely unknown. Their story became one of resilience and adaptation, 2 young lives starting over from zero, with only each other as links to whatever past they had lost. The caseworker who had become their primary advocate gently rocked the younger baby as the office lights dimmed each evening, whispering promises that somehow, somewhere, answers would emerge to explain their journey to that restroom floor. But for now, survival was enough. They were safe, they were together, and they were alive. In early 1990, the 2 sisters were placed with a loving family in Mohave, California, who opened their hearts and home to children whose stories began with abandonment, but would continue with hope. The adoptive parents were people of deep compassion who understood that love could grow even from the darkest beginnings. The girls thrived in their new environment, a peaceful Ventura County community where the pace of life allowed for healing and growth. Their new parents carefully preserved the newspaper clippings from their discovery, the photographs taken by social services, and every scrap of documentation that might someday help the children understand their origins. As they grew, the sisters developed distinct personalities, while maintaining the close bond forged in those early moments of shared abandonment. The older child, now given a stable name and identity, showed artistic inclinations and a gentle nature. The younger sister demonstrated an inquisitive spirit and natural leadership qualities that emerged even in childhood. Their adoptive parents approached their mysterious past with openness and honesty appropriate to their ages, always emphasizing that their abandonment reflected nothing about their worth as human beings. The children understood they had been found as babies, and that their birth family's circumstances remained unknown, but they grew up feeling secure in the love that surrounded them daily. Birthday parties, school plays, soccer games, and family vacations filled their childhood with the ordinary joys that had been stolen from them in those first terrifying months of life. They attended local schools, made friends, developed interests and talents that reflected their individual spirits rather than the trauma of their earliest experiences. The adoptive parents kept careful records of their growth and development, taking thousands of photographs that documented happy childhoods built on foundations of stability and unconditional love. If questions about their origins ever arose, there would be evidence of the lives they had built and the people they had become independent of whatever shadows lay in their past. Meanwhile, in Arizona, the Jane Doe case quietly aged in filing cabinets and evidence rooms. The woman in the desert remained nameless, her story untold, her connection to the thriving children in Ojai, completely unknown to investigators working hundreds of miles apart in different states, with different systems, and no reason to suspect their cases might be related. A childhood birthday photograph would later serve as evidence of lives reclaimed from tragedy too young. Girls blowing out candles on a homemade cake, surrounded by family and friends, their faces bright with the simple joy of celebration. They had no knowledge that somewhere in a government office, their discovery remained an unsolved mystery. For them, the only truth that mattered was the love that had surrounded them since that terrible morning in the restroom transformed into the first day of their real lives. For more than 3 decades, the Jane Doe file sat in the archives of the Mohave County Sheriff's Office, sharing space with hundreds of other unsolved cases, in a building that served as repository for the county's unfinished business. The file was thick with accumulated material, autopsy photographs that showed the young woman's stab wounds in clinical detail, crime scene sketches that mapped the desert location where her body was found, evidence bags containing fragments of torn clothing, and a DNA profile that had been added years later when technology made such testing possible. Periodically, new investigators would inherit the case, spreading the contents across their desks and studying each piece with fresh eyes. They would examine the tire track impressions, hoping to identify the specific make and model of vehicle that had left those marks in the sand. They would scrutinize the footprint casts, noting the different shoe sizes that suggested at least 2 individuals had been present at the scene. The autopsy report confirmed multiple stab wounds, but revealed no evidence of sexual assault, a detail that shaped investigators' theories about motive and suspect profile. The woman had been young, healthy, and showed no signs of prolonged malnutrition or abuse. Whatever had led to her death appeared to be acute, rather than the result of sustained violence or captivity. Technology evolved around the case like water flowing around a stone. Fingerprint databases expanded and improved. DNA testing became more sophisticated and widely available. National missing persons networks developed digital infrastructure that could instantly search millions of records. But Jane Doe remained nameless, her profile failing to match any missing person reports in the growing databases. Investigators would sometimes spread her few possessions across evidence tables, hoping to find some overlooked clue that might reveal her identity. But there was heartbreakingly little fragments of fabric, a few personal items too damaged or degraded to provide meaningful information, and the biological evidence that spoke to her death but not to her life. This became the slow grind of cold case investigation, dedicated professionals returning again and again to the same evidence, hoping that time, technology, or pure persistence might eventually unlock the secrets that had remained hidden for decades. The case survived budget cuts, personnel changes, and administrative reorganizations, primarily due to investigators who refused to let Jane Doe disappear completely into bureaucratic oblivion. Each detective who worked the case left notes for their successors, theories to explore, leads to follow up, contacts to maintain. The file became a conversation across time between investigators who might never meet but shared a commitment to speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. By 2022, the case had been reviewed by dozens of investigators, forensic analysts, and cold case specialists. Each brought different perspectives and expertise, but all reached the same frustrating conclusion: without additional information or a breakthrough in identification, Jane Doe would likely remain forever anonymous. In February 2022, investigator Lori Miller of the Mohave County Special Investigations Unit made a decision that would change everything. A veteran detective with extensive experience in cold cases, Miller had inherited the Jane Doe file and been struck by the quality of the preserved evidence and the thoroughness of the original investigation. Rather than accept the case's apparent hopelessness, Miller decided to resubmit the Jane Doe's fingerprints to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Database using upgraded scanning and comparison technology that had become available in recent years. The process required carefully cleaning and rephotographing the original prints, then uploading them through enhanced FBI systems that could detect matches missed by earlier technology. Miller approached the task with the methodical patience that characterized her work on difficult cases. She understood that cold case investigation was often about persistence rather than brilliance, the willingness to try the same approaches repeatedly as technology improved and databases expanded. What had yielded nothing in 2015 might produce results in 2022 if the right information had finally entered the system. The resubmission process took several days of careful technical work. Each fingerprint had to be scanned at multiple resolutions, cleaned digitally to remove artifacts from age and storage, and processed through comparison algorithms that had been refined over decades of development. Miller monitored the progress carefully, knowing that this represented one of their best remaining chances to identify the woman who had been nameless for over 30 years. When the system finally returned results, Miller initially assumed it was another false positive, the kind of near miss that had frustrated investigators countless times over the years. But closer examination revealed something extraordinary: a confirmed match with a 1989 arrest record from Bakersfield, California. The arrest record was for a woman named Maria Ortiz, charged with shoplifting in June 1989. The mugshot showed a young Hispanic woman whose features closely matched the reconstructed appearance of Jane Doe. Physical statistics aligned perfectly: height, weight, estimated age, and distinguishing characteristics all corresponded with the unidentified victim. Within hours, Miller was on the phone with the Bakersfield Police Department and Kern County Sheriff's Office, requesting additional information about Maria Ortiz. What she discovered would transform a decades-old cold case into an active investigation with national implications. The name, Maria Ortiz, was revealed to be an alias. The real identity of the woman in the mugshot was Marina Ramos, a 8-year-old mother who had used the false name during her arrest to avoid complications with outstanding warrants or immigration status. Marina had served a brief jail sentence and been released in August 1989, just months before Jane Doe's body was discovered in the Arizona desert. For the first time in over 3 decades, Jane Doe had a name, but the identification of Marina Ramos raised more questions than it answered, questions that would soon expand the investigation far beyond a single homicide case. The identification of Marina Ramos as the Jane Doe victim triggered an immediate expansion of the investigation as Miller and her team began reconstructing the final months of Marina's life. Working with California law enforcement agencies, they traced Marina's movements from her release from custody in August 1989 through her disappearance in the same month. Interviews with people who had known Marina revealed a complex portrait of a young woman struggling with poverty, family pressures, and the challenges of raising children while navigating an unstable economic situation. She had used the Maria Ortiz alias to avoid complications related to previous arrests, a common survival strategy among people living on society's margins. Marina's cousin, Esther, provided crucial details about Marina's final known whereabouts. She confirmed that Marina had come to collect her 2 young daughters, Elizabeth, approximately 14 months old, and Jasmin, about 2 months old, in August 1989, after being released from jail. Marina had been accompanied by a man she called Fernando, though Esther thought she had also heard the name Monico used to refer to the same individual. According to Esther's account, Marina had seemed nervous and eager to leave quickly. She spoke about going to Ontario, California, to start a new life, claiming that Fernando had work opportunities there. Despite Esther's concerns about the arrangement, Marina gathered her daughters and left that same day. It was the last time anyone in Marina's family would see her or the children alive. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. What had been a single homicide case was now potentially a multiple victim situation involving missing children. If Marina died in the Arizona desert in December 1989, what had happened to Elizabeth and Jasmin? No death records existed for children matching their descriptions from that time period. Miller's team expanded their search to include missing children databases, social services records, and adoption files throughout the southwestern United States. They contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, uploaded Marina's information to multiple law enforcement networks, and began the painstaking process of trying to account for 2 infants who had vanished along with their mother. The children's absence from official records was particularly troubling. In most cases involving family violence, children's bodies would be discovered near their parents, or evidence of their fate would emerge through witness statements or forensic investigation. But Elizabeth and Jasmin had simply disappeared, leaving no trace in any database or documentation system. DNA samples were collected from Marina's extended family to establish genetic profiles that could be used to identify remains or living relatives. The samples would be entered into genealogical databases and compared against unidentified persons' records throughout the country, expanding the search beyond traditional law enforcement channels. The investigation had evolved from a decades-old cold case into an active missing persons search with implications that extended far beyond Mohave County. Somewhere, possibly still alive, were 2 children who had disappeared with their mother more than 3 decades earlier. Finding them, whether alive or deceased, became the new focus of an investigation that had already defied every expectation about what was possible in cold case work. As news of Marina's identification spread through law enforcement networks, the case began attracting attention from missing children advocates, genealogy experts, and true crime communities who specialized in resolving decades-old disappearances. The combination of advanced DNA technology and persistent investigation had succeeded where traditional methods had failed, making Marina's case a symbol of hope for other families seeking answers. In 2023, the Mohave County Sheriff's Office launched a comprehensive public outreach campaign designed to generate leads about Marina's final days and the whereabouts of her daughters. The campaign included press conferences covered by regional and national media, social media appeals that reached hundreds of thousands of people, and partnerships with popular true crime podcasts that had proven effective in generating tips for other cold cases. Miller appeared on ABC 15's Crime Uncovered program, providing viewers with detailed timelines and asking for information from anyone who might have encountered Marina, Fernando, or the children during their final journey. The segment included age progression photos of what Elizabeth and Jasmin might look like as adults, generated by forensic artists using family photos and genetic prediction software. The story was featured on the APB Cold Case podcast, where Miller discussed the investigation's evolution from a nameless Jane Doe case to an active search for missing children. The podcast's large audience of true crime enthusiasts proved particularly valuable, as many listeners had personal experience with adoption, foster care, or family separation that made them sensitive to details others might overlook. Social media campaigns used hashtags like #FindElizabeth and Jasmin and #Marina Ramos to keep the case visible on platforms where viral stories could reach millions of people in days. The posts included photos of Marina from her youth, artist renderings of Fernando based on witness descriptions, and information about the timeline and locations involved in the family's disappearance. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Elizabeth and Jasmin to their database and website, creating profiles that would remain active indefinitely. These profiles could be accessed by law enforcement agencies worldwide and by individuals who suspected they might have information relevant to the case. Genealogical websites encouraged users to submit DNA samples if they believed they might be related to Marina or her children. These voluntary submissions expanded the genetic database available to investigators and increased the chances that familial connections might reveal the children's fate. Most tips generated by the campaign led to dead ends or cases of mistaken identity. People came forward claiming to be Elizabeth or Jasmin, but DNA testing quickly ruled out these possibilities. Others reported sightings or memories from the 1980s that seemed promising initially, but could not be verified through additional investigation. However, the sustained public attention kept Marina's story alive and ensured that her case remained a priority for investigators who might otherwise have moved on to more recent crimes. The campaign demonstrated how modern communication tools could breathe new life into cases that had seemed permanently stalled. The breakthrough came in 2025, when a genealogical database flagged a high-probability DNA match involving a woman living in California. The match was significant enough to warrant immediate follow-up, though investigators had learned to approach such leads with cautious optimism after years of false hopes and disappointed families. The woman, contacted through intermediaries to protect her privacy, agreed to speak with investigators about her background and the circumstances of her early childhood. What she revealed was so closely aligned with the Marina Ramos case that Miller's team immediately began formal verification procedures. The woman explained that she and her sister had been abandoned as infants in December 1989 at a park restroom in Oxnard, California. She had grown up knowing this basic fact about her origins, as her adoptive parents had been honest about the circumstances of her discovery and had preserved newspaper clippings and photographs from that day. Her sister, contacted separately, confirmed identical memories and provided additional details about their early childhood and adoption process. Both women described loving, adoptive families who had provided stable, nurturing environments while being open about the mystery surrounding their biological origins. The timeline matched perfectly with Marina's disappearance and death. The location was consistent with someone traveling from Bakersfield toward Arizona, who had made a detour through Ventura County. Most significantly, the ages of the abandoned children corresponded exactly with Marina's daughters, Elizabeth and Jasmin. Both women agreed to provide DNA samples for comparison with Marina's family genetic profile. The samples were processed on an expedited basis, given the potential significance of the match and the decades-long wait for answers about the children's fate. When the results confirmed biological relationship to the Ramos family, investigators faced the extraordinary situation of having solved not just a murder case, but a missing children investigation that had remained invisible to law enforcement for over 30 years. The abandoned babies found in the Oxnard restroom were indeed Marina's daughters, alive and well, and living productive adult lives. The revelation transformed the entire understanding of Marina's final journey. She had died alone in the Arizona desert, while her daughters were abandoned hundreds of miles away in California. The logistics of this sequence suggested coordination by multiple individuals and raised complex questions about who had been responsible for which actions in the family's tragic separation. Miller's team immediately began re-examining all evidence from both crime scenes with this new information in mind. The tire tracks at the desert location, the witness sightings at the Oxnard Park, and the timeline between Marina's death and the children's abandonment all took on new significance now that investigators knew they were dealing with connected events rather than isolated incidents. The sisters were given the opportunity to learn about their biological mother and the circumstances that had led to their separation from her. For the first time in their lives, they had answers to questions that had shaped their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They chose to reclaim their birth names, while honoring the adoptive families who had raised them with love and stability. With the identification of Elizabeth and Jasmin as the abandoned Oxnard babies, investigators turned their attention to the critical question of who had been responsible for Marina's death and the children's abandonment. The evidence suggested a complex sequence of events involving multiple individuals and locations over several days in December 1989. Crime scene analysis from the Arizona desert location revealed tire tracks and footprints in different sizes, indicating that at least 2 people had been present when Marina's body was left there. The positioning and condition of the remains suggested she had been killed at the site rather than transported there after death, pointing to the location as a planned destination rather than a random dumping ground. Witness accounts from the Oxnard Park described seeing a Hispanic woman and 2 Hispanic men near the restroom around the time the babies were discovered. These sightings were accompanied by reports of a black mini pickup truck that had left the area shortly before the children were found. The presence of multiple individuals suggested that Marina's murder and the children's abandonment had been coordinated activities rather than the actions of a single person acting alone. The mysterious Fernando, also known as Monico, remained the primary person of interest in Marina's murder. He had been the last known person to see Marina alive when they left Bakersfield together with the children in August 1989. His identity had never been confirmed, despite extensive investigation, and no one in Marina's circle had ever seen him again after their departure. Investigators created detailed profiles of potential suspect characteristics based on witness descriptions, crime scene evidence, and behavioral analysis of the coordinated nature of the crimes. The ability to separate Marina from her children, transport them to different locations, and abandon the babies without harming them suggested individuals with specific knowledge of the area and possibly experience with children. The geographic pattern of the crimes from Bakersfield to the Arizona desert to Oxnard indicated familiarity with southwestern travel routes and possible connections to criminal networks that operated across state lines. The timing between Marina's death and the children's abandonment suggested either careful planning or rapid improvisation by people who understood how to move. Without detection, modern forensic techniques were applied to preserved evidence from both crime scenes. DNA analysis was expanded beyond the original samples to include trace materials that might have been overlooked in 1989. Tire track patterns were compared against vehicle registration databases to narrow the field of possible trucks that could have left the impressions found at both locations. Digital facial reconstruction technology was used to create updated images of what Fernando might look like today, assuming he had survived the intervening decades. These images were distributed through law enforcement networks and published in media coverage of the case, hoping to generate recognition from people who might have encountered him in recent years. Despite these extensive efforts, Fernando's identity remained unknown. The investigation had succeeded in reuniting Marina with her name, and her daughters with their history. But the person responsible for destroying their family remained anonymous, possibly still alive, possibly still dangerous. The case as it stands today represents both a triumph of modern investigative techniques and a reminder that some questions may never receive complete answers. Marina Ramos is no longer Jane Doe. She has been returned to her family. Her name has been restored to official records, and her daughters know who they are and where they came from. But justice remains incomplete without identifying those responsible for her death. The Mohave County Sheriff's Office maintains active tip lines and regularly releases public appeals for information about Fernando, Monico, or anyone else who might have been involved in Marina's murder and the abandonment of her children. The case appears on cold case websites, true crime podcasts, and social media platforms, where it continues to generate discussion and potential leads. Advances in genealogical research and DNA technology offer hope that Fernando's identity might eventually be revealed through the same methods that led to Marina's identification and the discovery of her daughters. As more people submit samples to genealogical databases, and as analytical techniques become more sophisticated, the chances of finding genetic connections to the perpetrator continue to increase. The investigation has revealed the confirmed facts of Marina's final journey. She left Bakersfield with Fernando and her two daughters in August 1989, traveled to an unknown location where she lived for several months, was murdered in the Arizona desert in December 1989, and her children were abandoned, alive but unharmed, in Oxnard, California, 2 days later. These facts establish a timeline and geographic pattern, but leave crucial questions unanswered about motive, perpetrator identity, and the specific circumstances that led to Marina's death. Elizabeth and Jasmin, now adults with families and careers of their own, have chosen to engage with their newfound history while protecting their privacy and honoring the families who raised them. They represent the unexpected victory in a case defined by loss, 2 lives that survived despite the violence that claimed their mother, 2 women who reclaimed their names, and their connection to a woman who died trying to provide them with better opportunities. The sisters have provided victim impact statements describing how the knowledge of their origins has affected them and their families. While grateful to finally understand their history, they carry the complex emotions of survivors who lost something they never knew they had. Their mother's love is evidenced by their survival, but their separation from her story for over 3 decades represents a different kind of loss: the theft of memory, identity, and family connection that can never be fully restored. Marina's extended family has also been profoundly affected by the investigation's revelations. Relatives who had assumed she simply disappeared to start a new life were forced to confront the violent reality of her death and the fact that her children had been alive and well throughout the decades of their ignorance. The family has publicly expressed gratitude for the investigators' persistence and hope that Marina's killer will eventually be brought to justice. The case has become a symbol of the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes and missing persons cases. Law enforcement agencies throughout the country have cited Marina's identification as evidence that advances in technology and changes in investigative techniques can breathe new life into cases that seem permanently stalled. True crime communities have embraced Marina's story as an example of how public engagement can contribute to solving cold cases. The combination of professional investigation, technological advancement, and sustained public attention created the conditions necessary for breakthrough discoveries that might not have occurred through traditional law enforcement channels alone. The story has also highlighted systemic issues that allowed Marina and her children to become invisible to the very agencies designed to protect them. A young woman using an alias, moving between temporary addresses, and existing in the economic margins, could disappear without triggering missing person investigations. Her children could be abandoned and adopted without any connection being made to their mother's murder hundreds of miles away. These gaps in communication and coordination between agencies, though improved by modern technology and protocols, still exist in ways that can allow vulnerable people to fall through systemic cracks. Marina's case serves as a reminder that the most marginalized members of society are often those most at risk of violence and least likely to receive immediate attention when they disappear. The investigation continues with renewed focus on identifying Fernando, Monico, and anyone else who might have been involved in Marina's murder. Investigators maintain contact with genealogical researchers, monitor databases for potential matches, and follow up on tips that continue to arrive from the public. The case remains active in all relevant law enforcement systems and is regularly reviewed for new investigative opportunities. Advanced forensic techniques are periodically applied to preserved evidence as technology improves and new analytical methods become available. What could not be determined in 1989 or even 2022 might yield results in future years as science continues to advance and databases continue to expand. The evidence waiting in storage could provide the breakthrough needed to finally identify Marina's killer. The geographic scope of the investigation has expanded to include areas where Fernando might have lived before or after Marina's murder. Investigators continue to pursue leads that place him in various southwestern communities during the late 1980s and early 1990s, hoping to establish patterns of movement or residence that could aid in his identification. Public appeals for information continue through multiple channels, emphasizing that someone, somewhere, knows who Fernando really was and what happened during those crucial months between Marina's disappearance from Bakersfield and her death in Arizona. The passage of time may have loosened tongues that were once bound by fear, loyalty, or ignorance about the seriousness of the crimes involved. Cold case investigators understand that solving decades-old murders often requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to approach the same evidence repeatedly as circumstances change. Witnesses who were once reluctant to speak may become more cooperative as years pass. Technologies that did not exist when the crimes were committed continue to reveal new possibilities for analysis and comparison. The case file that once contained only the mystery of Jane Doe now overflows with confirmed identities, family connections, DNA profiles, and investigative leads that extend across multiple states and decades. What began as a single homicide has evolved into a complex investigation, touching issues of domestic violence, child abandonment, interstate crime, and the long-term effects of unresolved trauma on families and communities. Marina's photograph now occupies a place of honor in the Mohave County Sheriff's Office, surrounded by evidence boards, mapping the investigation's progress and the relationships between various suspects, witnesses, and locations. Her name appears on victim memorial websites and in databases that ensure she will not be forgotten again, regardless of whether her killer is ever identified. The investigation has also generated academic interest among criminologists and forensic scientists studying cold case methodology, DNA genealogy, and the use of public engagement in solving historical crimes. Marina's case provides a detailed example of how multiple investigative approaches can be combined effectively and how technological advancement can resurrect cases that seemed permanently unsolvable. Law enforcement agencies have used Marina's case as a training example for investigators learning cold case techniques, demonstrating how persistence, technological adaptation, and multi-agency cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The case illustrates that successful cold case investigation requires both technical expertise and human empathy, the willingness to speak for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. For Marina's daughters, the investigation's success has meant reclaiming not just their names but their place in a family history that extends far beyond the tragedy of their mother's death. They have connected with relatives who never knew they had survived, creating new relationships while honoring the adoptive families who provided them with stability and love during their formative years. The children Marina died trying to protect have grown into women who understand both the price of their survival and the depth of their mother's love. They carry her legacy forward, not through tragedy, but through the full, productive lives. They have built lives that stand as testament to the fierce maternal instinct that drove Marina to seek better opportunities for them, even at the cost of her own safety. As the investigation continues, Marina's story serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration, a reminder that violence against vulnerable women often goes unnoticed and unsolved, but also proof that determination, technology, and public engagement can sometimes triumph over time, silence, and deliberate concealment. Her voice, silenced in the desert 36 years ago, now speaks through the investigators, family members, and community advocates who refuse to let her story end with her death. The case remains open, active, alive with possibility. Every day brings potential for the breakthrough that could finally identify Fernando and provide complete justice for Marina and closure for her daughters. Until that day arrives, the investigation continues, driven by the simple belief that every victim deserves justice, every family deserves truth, and every crime, no matter how old or cold, deserves the persistent attention of those committed to speaking for the silenced. In the end, Marina Ramos achieved in death what she sought in life. Her children found safety, stability, and love. Her story continues not in the silence of the grave, but in the voices of Elizabeth and Jasmin, who carry her DNA, her resilience, and her fierce love for family into the future. They are her victory over violence, her answer to those who thought they could erase her completely, and her proof that some bonds transcend even death itself. The desert wind still blows across Old Temple Bar Road, but it no longer carries Marina's story into oblivion. Her name echoes in courtrooms, newsrooms, and the determined voices of investigators who refuse to let another case grow cold. The woman who died seeking a better life for her children has become a symbol of hope for all the nameless victims whose stories wait in filing cabinets for someone to refuse to let them be forgotten. And somewhere, possibly reading these words, is the person who knows what really happened in December 1989. Time may have grayed their hair and lined their face, but it cannot erase the truth they carry. Marina's daughters have their names back, their history restored, their mother's love confirmed. Now they wait, along with law enforcement and a watching public, for the justice that time delayed but cannot ultimately deny. The investigation continues. The case remains open. Marina Ramos has finally come home,